طيب, thank you. You know, you prepare a speech, and then Lara tell you. So you had speeches, so let's start with some comments. First, we are happy that we have second round of election now. It's like second chance, at least for the Arab community, you know, with the whole joint list. But it's also an opportunity for the Palestinian Arab community to try to find some kind of common language with the opposition. I don't call them the peace camp. I call them the opposition. In September, we have election, and probably the opposition camp will lose again the election unless something serious will be done. And the serious thing that need to be done is very clear, to be an alternative to Netanyahu vision of separation, walls, occupation, corruption, and abuse of the Jews and the Palestinians. Let me be clear. You know, we had 8 years of Obama administration, and the first time that we met with the National Security Council team, when they drafted the strategy paper, we had a discussion, you know, about what should be the language of the American administration. It was something like Jewish state and rights for all its citizens, and the Palestinian state. It sounds like the Jewish nation law. And it was the American administration, Obama's administration strategy paper. So I think for now, we need to present an alternative to Netanyahu that will bring peace even in self-determination. And here, I follow your work also, Jeremy, and the language that you are using. We need to make it clear that in the other side, on the opposition side, there is a clear language that will be different than the language of two states with separation. Because the two states with the separation haven't been worked not in Gaza and not in the West Bank. The language that we have to bring, even if it will be two-state solution, a language of the inclusion of the Jewish people in the Middle East, equality for all, democracy, and living together. The language of Netanyahu of more occupation, more settlements, more frustration. You know, I was arrested a year ago in a demonstration in Haifa. Friday evening, nothing special in Haifa downtown, and I became for like 24 hours the enemy of all the Israeli government. Since then, I was around in this country, in Israel at least, not in the US. There is some similarities. And I noticed that police violence is part of the culture that we exist in Israel, because when you implement occupation, the occupation come in also when you treat your Arab citizens and then also other Jewish communities. So in this sense, what we need now, it's clear, you know, the Jewish nation state law, the citizenship law, it divides families. 30,000 families from the cross border, the green line, is divided. Settlers can get married to Israeli citizens and live together, but Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel that get married to Palestinians from Barta'a al-Sharqiyya and Barta'a al-Gharbiyya, it's divided small village. They can't live together, they have to be divided. This reality of oppression against the Palestinian Arab minority in Israel have been the practice for the last 15 years of Netanyahu. Now for now, he have the backup of the American administration. And this is, you know, why we are here. We are here because we need you in the US to be much more proactive, to bring a new vision of peace, and to understand that in the election in Israel, there is like identity voting, and I think you will talk about the identity voting. It's not only about the Arab community to be the reserve of the Israeli left, okay? You know, the language of Jewish state, unfortunately, is a language also that have been promoted here in the US. It was the language of the last administration. We can't live in a reality that we are second-class citizens as a result of constitutional law that will say Arabic is not the language of the state, will say that segregation in housing is legal. After decades of struggle on the civil rights movement, we won several cases to prevent segregation in housing. Imagine that the basic law today will make it legal and possible to implement segregation in housing again, and even segregation in employment places. So in this sense, there is like a lot of frustration in the Palestinian community, but also we have soon another election The Arab community probably will be united in the next election in September, and I hope that we can bring a new language of self-determination of the Jews and the Palestinians and minority rights, not language of Jewish state anymore. Because the Jewish state, the implications of the Jewish state in the way that the Jewish nation-state law have been implemented on us means segregation in housing, discrimination, half of the Arab community living under the poverty line, and this is a reality that we can't live with if we want to go and vote and feel that we can be part of the democratic game inside Israel.
So, Jafar, let me follow up on that. You've mentioned the joint list. You've mentioned the possibility of the Arab parties, Palestinian parties voting, running together. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happened to the joint list in the last elections? Because parties ran separately. And what the likelihood of the parties running together is for this next election, and potentially, you know, what that can mean for voter turnout, for impact in terms of the Knesset.
You know, the power of the people was implemented in the last election. It's like in the exams. You have second option, and now in September probably the lessons will be learned from the joint list failure to run together. It's clear if you open the Facebook and social networks in Arabic now inside Israel, you will see that everybody is telling the political leadership, actually, if you will not run again together, we will not go and vote. And this is actually what happened. Only 52% of the Arab community went and voted. But the core problem that we face as a community when it comes to the political activism is what we can offer our community when we sit in the opposition. Okay? The last election in 2015, the joint list gained 13 seats, and the promise was that we will win. What we will win? We will not win with 13 seats. We can win if we can get or be part of the 61 seats. That's, you know, when you change the language, the atmosphere, in the way that we did in 92 to 95. So this promise failed, actually, because of the failure of the Israeli left to be relevant to the Jewish population. So to be able to get 61 seats, it's not enough to get 40 or 45 Jewish members of the Knesset. You need to have at least 50 of the Jewish parties, you know, also at the left, but even the ones that are not calling themselves left, need to do much better in outreaching and offering the Jewish population a new discourse. So in this sense, the failure of the joint list is a result of the failure of the whole left in Israel, the whole peace camp in Israel. I think today, the Arab community, the pressure from the public is very clear. Go together in one list, and it's clear today what is the political power of each political party, from the Islamic movement to the Communist Party. So the negotiation started yesterday. I expect in 2 weeks it will be clear how the list will be actually created. The question will be, the serious question will be, you know, if the Jewish opposition, I will not call it left or peace, if the Jewish opposition will know how to outreach to enough Jewish voters to get the 61 seats with the Arab community, and to deal with the Arab community that we are partners and not the reserve of the opposition. When they will win the election, they will create a coalition with Shas and other right-wing parties.
Well, that's the last question I want to ask you in this round. So historically, we have seen in Israel, and I have to say, you know, saying this out loud in the United States, it's painful. I mean, the argument of the opposition, which sees itself as the left, some of it I view as the left, has been, we are not going to sit in government, we will not sit in a coalition with Arab parties. It's as if, you know, an American politician said, I'll be elected, but I'll never co-sponsor a bill that's, you know, from someone who's a different ethnicity. It's quite stunning. And it seems to be suggesting that for even large parts of the opposition, the view is that 20% of the population cannot be a legitimate partner for decision-making for the state of Israel. Do you see that changing? I mean, after this long with Netanyahu, the rising illiberalism, concerns, I mean, is there an opposition that is ready to not just stand and say we're going to be tougher in opposing Netanyahu, but is going to look itself in the mirror and say this is not an acceptable position, saying we will not sit with the people that represent 20% of the population? Is there any change going on there?
Look, if they want to win and to replace Netanyahu, this is the only option that they have. They have to understand that the Arab community is a partner. We are there to stay, and we are part of the game. And we are actually, will be the game changer even, okay? There is not, today the vision of the left or the peace camp in Israel is not clear vision. What do you mean when you say two-state solution with a Jewish state? For the Arab community, it's like something that most of us will reject that. So you have to clarify and you have to create a new vision for the peace camp in Israel. So you have to start from that part of the discourse to change the discourse. And part of the change of the discourse is to tell the Jewish public clearly, 40% of the physicians of Rambam Hospital are Arab physicians. They treat Jewish citizens of the State of Israel. So if our physicians are good enough to work on the hospitals, we are good enough to be part of the coalition. Now, we don't want to be part of the coalition if the coalition will not go for peace and ending the occupation and the tragedy of our brothers and sisters and guarantee equality, okay? But between 93 to 95, the 6 Arab MKs in that period, today now we have 10 and we will have 13 probably. The 6 Arab MKs in 93 to 95, they gave Rabin government the needed majority to ensure the startup of Oslo Agreement and also to approve state budgets for several years. The same happened in 2005. In 2005, in the disengagement from Gaza, when it came to the floor in the Knesset, the Arab parties were against the disengagement from Gaza. Then Yasser Arafat and the leadership of the Palestinian people said, we need the disengagement and we need you to support the disengagement from Gaza. We thought from the beginning that it's failure, that it's problematic agreement. And it was proven later. So in this sense, any government that want to have a regional process, want to have any kind of peaceful process that will lead for more security and more peace in the region and democracy, they will need the Arab community. So in this sense, they have to upgrade their discourse. They have to be brave enough as a left or progressive or opposition and to come back to the Jewish public and to tell them, yes, we need the Arab community to be part of the 61 that will create a new discourse and new language, a new future for both nations.
All right, so Shibley, that's a good segue to you. You have done polling for years, and some of the most striking polling you did was actually back, it was almost 5 years ago. You did polling of the Israeli public, and I actually have the quote here that we had almost 50% of the Israeli Jewish public agreed with the statement, quote, Arabs should be expelled or transferred from Israel. And I want you to talk a little bit about those sort of attitudes and whether or not, based on what you've seen over the years in polling, you see any shift in that. It's clearly attitudes like that that allowed things like the nation-state law to take root. But can you address a little bit what you took away from that polling, what you understood about the Israeli Jewish population?
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is really a central question. And actually, when that poll was released by Pew, I was one of many advisors for that poll in Israel. I did write a piece for the Washington Post, and the title of the piece was "How Israel's Jewishness is Overtaking Its Democracy." And the idea was this one finding that nearly half of Israelis wanted to expel all Arabs from Israel. We're not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. We're talking about from Israel. Was really quite stunning. Since then, we've done a lot more polling, including one that I have not yet released among Jewish Israelis, that shows that Jewish identity has overtaken Israeli identity. So when you ask people, are you first Israeli or are you first Jewish or are you both? Now you have a solid majority that says, I'm first Jewish. not first Israeli. So there is a bolstering of Jewish identity coupled with seeing the Arabs as the other throughout this whole period. Now, what explains that is complicated, obviously. It's not just a straightforward explanation. One, of course, has to do with changing demographics and the rising percentage of Orthodox Jews in Israel and so forth. And remarkably, Israel is the only country that I know of where young Israelis are more conservative than old Israelis. I mean, this is certainly not true here in America. It's not true among Palestinians. It's not true among, we find like globally, global identity is rising among young people, but in Israel, Jewish identity is overtaken Israeli identity and global identity. So there is a demographic change that is in that direction. But part of this is the discourse. And I think the point that Jafar made early really has to be understood because it's not about a one state or two states. I mean, there are people, obviously, who believe that two states are no longer possible. In fact, I would say that's a majority of Israelis, a majority of Palestinians, including those who would accept two states, no longer believe it's possible. And if you believe it's no longer possible, if you're a Jewish Israeli and you believe in Jewish identity and you are going to have essentially a population that might overtake you, what are going to be your presuppositions or your attitudes toward them? And in some ways that bringing, instead of making the West Bankers equal, lowering the status of Arabs inside because they're all Arabs and Palestinians, when citizenship and democracy isn't the principle, that's kind of what we see taking place because of that. So I think that the discourse of focus on the separation is a problem. And I think that the advocates of a two-state solution have not fully understood that, including people who genuinely and honestly believe it's still possible. And it may be. I'm not going to argue the point here. It may be. But the point is, what has happened is every year that has gone by, it's become less and less possible. And it may, in fact, not be possible. And in the process, not only have we seen kind of the promise of a two-state is in essence making occupation and inequality seem a temporary state of affairs and therefore rationalizing injustice as a temporary state of affairs awaiting a resolution. That's one problem. But in the meanwhile, by focusing on the thought that Arabs and Jews must be separated, the thought that ethnicity and religiosity are part of any structure that you want, you're reinforcing it in a context that is not necessarily leading to a two-state solution, and therefore, in a way, increasing this inequality. And with it, I would say, obviously, it resonates on both ends because that plays out. Because, as we know, identity is an interactive thing. The Jews react to how Arabs see themselves or define themselves, and Arabs react to how Jews define themselves. We see Arab identity emerging among Palestinian Israelis as well.
Thank you. I would ask, one of the arguments that we have been using, all of us in the peace camp for years, is as if that talking point has paved the way for the loss of both, and led to this, a moment where the Jewishness of Israel is actually becoming the factor that prevents there being any solution of any kind, and democracy is lost along the way. I want to ask you another question, and it's a leading question because I have in front of me a March 25th article that you wrote, where you basically, in some ways, predicted very, very well what would happen with the Arab vote, in the Palestinian vote, in the last Israeli elections. Can you talk a little bit about why we saw such a drop in the voter turnout for Palestinian citizens of Israel? It was 49% in April. In last election in 2015, it was 64%. And obviously, there is the demonization and incitements against Palestinian citizens of Israel. There is voter suppression. There are things like the reports of cameras in the polling stations, blah, blah, blah. But you're talking about identity, and your article points to some bigger trends here on why Palestinians of citizens of Israel would be stepping back and not choosing to vote. And
Yeah.
I'd actually ask you to make a prediction about the next vote while you're at it.
Yeah, I think that, when you look at obviously, it was hard to predict really how Arabs are going to turn out or not turn out in the prior election, separate from the fact that they were not unified this time around. I think that's a factor, but I don't think it's the whole factor. There is one fact that's not particularly sexy. It's just blatant, voter suppression, and it's structural. I mean, look, for example, Arabs historically have voted in large numbers in local council elections. In fact, in the last local council election in the fall, they turn up in much larger numbers than Jews. They vote, they participate. Why? Because they thought there was something, they were meaningful for them. And in fact, there was once a time when local elections and national elections were held together. So the voter turnout is much higher among Arabs because they're turning up for the local elections, they participate more. In fact, the best solution actually for turnout for Arabs in Israel is to bring local elections and national elections together. And that's not going to happen because obviously the majority wants to suppress the Arab vote. That's not going to happen. So there is that, obviously, which is a particular problem. There's the deliberate attempt at voter suppression that we have seen with Netanyahu's statements that essentially scare the Jewish voters, increase the Jewish vote, maybe participation, by saying Arabs are turning out. And with that, I think that if you incorporate the nation-state law, the language that the Prime Minister of Israel, who's been a long-time Prime Minister of Israel, has been using to address Arab citizens of Israel. When you consider that not much has happened in their favor, even when they had a larger representation in the Knesset. When you consider the Trump administration and its attitudes on this very issue, and I want to address that because I think it's central. When you add all of that together, then you are talking about identity politics, and people will say, this is not my state, this is not for me, even if at the same time they say, no, when I ask them, do you think you should play into Netanyahu's hands and give him what he's asking for? Shouldn't you essentially say, no, I'm going to turn out? A large number say, yes, we should not play into his hand. But ultimately, look at how many people here in America who voted for Bernie Sanders who didn't vote at all, allowing for Donald Trump to win the election, right? This is, we see this happening. It's not sort of puzzling for us political scientists to see this identity politics that is somewhat or seemingly irrational in the sense that it's resulting in something. And that's why politicians play on it, because they know it works even if it seems to be irrational. Now, I want to tie this to the Trump administration policy, because my fear is that this language of ethnicity and religion as a way of legitimizing and justifying a political order, or political moves, or occupation, or sovereign control over territory is, in fact, enhancing this kind of racial divide and ethnic divide that is emerging, and is reinforcing it, and reinforcing in a way that maybe in the short term favoring Israel and the Jews, but in the long term, it's disastrous for all, including for Jews, because frankly, if you are thinking about it, if you posit this, if you see this conflict as a nationalist conflict with legitimate nationalist aspirations that could be reconciled. It's not so much a religious and ethnic conflict, even though religion and ethnicity play a role. That you can see accommodation even inside, of course, but more importantly, you can see accommodations outside with the Arab world. Because if you posit this as I have a right to sovereignty over East Jerusalem, to sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, because I am Jewish or because God gave this to the Jews, even if you have Arab leaders acquiesce in this, even for convenient reasons, whether it's the King of Saudi Arabia or whether it's the President of Egypt, or there's a King of Abdullah who might be weak and they have to, understandably, have to survive and have to acquiesce in whatever, the public is not going to accept that. And when it is defined as a Jewish Muslim or Jewish Arab, you are really encoding a conflict down the road when it's going to be fueled again, because an Egyptian may be an Egyptian first, but will never stop being also an Arab, and will never stop being also a Muslim or a Christian. And they will never accept a justification based on religion that trumps Muslims and Arabs. And look at what's happening in Egypt. 40 years of peace treaty. It has worked very well on the security level. It has worked very well government to government. It's still working very well. Nothing is threatening it. But look at the public in Egypt. 40 years later, they're even less accepting of Israel, not more accepting of Israel. They see Israel as the enemy, and most of it has to do with the fact, the way Israel is defining the conflict and treating the Palestinians. So there is much more at stake here in the definition, this ethnic and religious justification of control than just for Palestinian Israelis.
Great. So Maya, I want to pick up on that. And it's, it's not for nothing that the Arab American Institute is co-sponsoring this event. And AAI for years has sort of been involved on, obviously, the range of Middle East issues. It hasn't been super focused on Israel-Palestine. There's a lot of other issues on the plate for the Arab American community. I want you to talk to us a little bit about how particularly the growing illiberalism in Israel and the growing, the squeezing of the Palestinians and citizens of Israel sort of interfaces with Arab Americans, with the BDS movement, with support for more pressure on Israel. Because historically, Palestinians and citizens of Israel have played a sort of awkward role in this debate in the United States. They have challenged, I think it's fair to say, they've challenged Arab American views about Israel. These are citizens, they speak Hebrew, they carry a passport, they're not clamoring to give up their passports. And at the same time, they've been held up by parts of the Jewish community. Look, they're judges, look, they're diplomats, look, Israel has a healthy democracy. At this moment, those arguments are under greater strain than ever before. Can you talk to us a little bit about how this is understood or not understood, and how it maybe fuels some of the growing engagement we're seeing in America on Israel-Palestine at the grassroots level?
Sure. Well, thanks again. Am I on? Is there something I should do? It's working. Okay. Thanks again to all my colleagues and.
Turn up a little bit.
Okay. Sure. Closer to this one will work. There you go. Okay. Thanks again to all my colleagues, and especially Jafar, to have you here. Jeremy and I were joking that we just need to listen to you talk and not contribute much more beyond that. Last year in this room, I was in the audience listening to an Israeli human rights lawyer who was talking about the passage of the nation-state law. And he, at that time, provided an assessment that said, this is the game changer. This is the end of the discussions about 67 occupation exclusively, and more about 48 and the consequences of what it means to live as a Palestinian in a country that's decided that self-determination and equality appear to be exclusively the right of someone who's Jewish. And I remember sitting in the audience thinking, this is a correct assessment, and wow, this is going to be tremendous in terms of how American policymakers understand this. Because you're right, Lara, we spend, the Institute does a great deal of work, and probably a small percentage of that is focused on foreign policy. In fact, we do a great deal of work where we talk about the domestic implications of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We focus on First Amendment protected rights in states across the country that are attempting to ban BDS, meaning the opportunity to engage in nonviolent protests, boycotts, sanctions. Department of Education attempts to suppress college campuses in terms of controlling speech on this issue, equating the very dangerous equating of anti-Semitism with the criticism of the State of Israel at the time where our hate crime data released in November of 2018 showed a surge in real anti-Semitism, a 37% increase. So these things have come at a time that could not be worse in terms of where our country is on some of these issues. And I remember, as I said, thinking this is a bad development for the region. It's certainly a bad development for Israelis. And of course, it's a bad development for the Palestinian citizens of that country. But I thought this would be the eye-opener, right? This could be the opportunity for policymakers to understand differently what's been happening. And you know, you're right, Shibley, about the two-state solution piece, whether it's, you know, I too no longer say one state, two state, I don't care, right? At this point, to be a rational human being, it's no longer possible to, I think, argue that this is all viable. But I think one of the things that's important is to understand that the failure of the two-state option is not by accident, it was by design, right? I mean, these have been the policies we put in place here. So we get to the point where 48, right, Israel, the idea that we have the judges and we have the doctors and we're supposed to be this, if we can only get the 67 problem to align with what we have in place for 48, everything will be fine, only to learn, oh boy, that's not fine either. And that's the piece of it that these policymakers have been fixated on. And instead what happens, regrettably, I mean, what are the headlines we're reading about right now in terms of what's happening on the Hill? That the Israeli government is arguing against a resolution that includes two states. So they're lobbying about removing the two-state reference from that resolution, a resolution that is, for all purposes, practically meaningful. The other thing we're talking about is a legislation or a resolution that talks about an economic package. Josh is in the audience. He wrote a wonderful piece talking about why that one is particularly problematic. What's the other thing we're talking about? A non-binding resolution on BDS, and we're supposed to treat it as benign because it's non-binding. But the reality is, when we tried to bring Omar Barghouti here to the United States recently to have a conversation with Americans about what as a co-founder of the BDS movement, what does it mean to advocate for these issues, he was denied entry to the United States. A month later, Hanan Ashrawi was denied entry to the United States. I'm not sure how non-binding and benign all of this is. So I think the challenge for us in this conversation is to, I don't want to sound unhopeful about all this.
You're doing a good job, though.
Thank you. So as part of this panel conversation on Saturday, it had nothing to do with this issue. It was about civic engagement and how we engage in this process. And I was equally optimistic in terms of the challenges to our democratic institutions right now. And I think an honest assessment of the situation is not particularly great. So one of the person in the audience, I thought just nailed it perfectly when he asked the question about, well, this is not great, but you've literally ripped the Band-Aid off. There's no way to talk about this issue anymore in that old language that we used to do. The reality is simply different. So I think as problematic as all this is, it does give us an opportunity to have an honest conversation about U.S. policy towards this region, how much we've contributed to the ongoing occupation, to the ongoing denial of Palestinian human rights, to the structure where a country can pass a nation-state law and it doesn't seem to have impacted our own relationship with it in terms of our bilateral peace. And I say all of that without any discussion of Trump, because I think you're right. I think Jafar's exactly right. What we were doing before any of that got us here. How's that?
If I can ask you a follow-up. When Omar was supposed to be here and the event ended up happening via Skype, and he was very good, He was asked a question by someone in the audience about when he talked about liberating Palestinian land, whether he meant everything river to the sea or just the occupied territories. He was talking about liberating occupied territories. And I think it was meant to be a gotcha question where it would prove that BDS is delegitimizing the state of Israel, blah, blah, blah. And his answer was, setting aside how any individual Palestinian would feel, he said, we are talking about this using the terms of international law, and that means we are talking about the occupied territories. I don't know if this is something you feel comfortable addressing. I'm interested in, at the grassroots level, if 5 years ago, when I was on campus talking to activists, to kids, and I said, in your activism, I encourage you to draw the green line. I believe that's the most effective way to register your protest, to tell Israelis that this isn't anti-Israel, it's against your policies, it's arbitrary, it's manufactured, but it is the right way to go because it will have impact. And I'm not sure that that argument is particularly effective now when neither Israel nor the United States wants to draw the green line. And I'm interested, again, Omar still drew it when he was explaining that answer. He said, no, we use that green line. But when activists are talking about now rights and democracy and international law, is it even possible to still make that distinction and have people hear you?
I think it is in terms of the work that gets done here. And that's an incredibly important distinction that has to be drawn, particularly for members of Congress. Congressional pandering is a thing, and when they want to do it, they have to do it at least within the confines of respecting international law and stated U.S. policy for decades. So I think that distinction I agree with completely, Lara. But you are right in that you've noticed a change, because Students for Justice in Palestine are also talking now very openly, and you have state resolutions that are taking place in terms of the upcoming 2020 presidential election cycle that talk about the right of return. And that didn't happen before. And I think that is a product of blurring that green line. So if you have created a vision for Palestinians, citizens of the state of Israel, that on some level, while not the brutal occupation, is so denial of equal rights, then you would understand why a student is now incorporating other and significantly more difficult, what we used to call final status issues, as part of this conversation. So I think you're seeing the conversation around right of return popping up in that way, and I think you'll continue to see that. And arguably, maybe that's part of the positive developments that take place here, in that there has to be an international conversation about this that's broader than two states and lip service to two states and the idea that we're going to get somewhere different than what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
It almost seems as if reality has called the bluff of those of us who for years warned, if you don't make progress on peace, these issues are going to come and haunt you. And it's like, okay, here are these issues. They've come to haunt us, which is a good segue to Jeremy. Jeremy, I want you to talk a little bit about the perspective of the American Jewish community that is supportive of Israel and is supportive of peace, which hasn't changed. I grew up in a community where our views on Israel were consistently framed. I mean, through the present day, in terms of shared values, shared commitment to democracy, shared commitment to rights, all of that stuff. Obviously, that is challenged by the growing illiberalism in Israel. And much like what Maya said, I thought sort of the final wake-up call, if we hadn't had it yet, was going to be the nation-state law. Can you talk a little bit about how this descent into a liberalism is felt here, and how it is dealt with by people who still believe they want Israel to exist? I think would say openly they want it to have a Jewish character, maybe not use the language Jewish state, maybe there's some formulation around that, but they want Israel to be Israel. And how do they reconcile that with an Israel that is galloping towards ethnic illiberalism?
So first of all, thanks, Lara. I always enjoy being the token right-winger on a panel. It's a honor that I rarely get. So as someone who I believe remains rational, but still believes two states is the only way to go, and someone who believes in the idea of a national homeland for the Jewish people alongside a national homeland for the Palestinian people, I remain a last two-state flag waver happily on this panel. I do think that there is a interesting conversation beginning to happen inside the American Jewish establishment. For 70 plus years, there's been tremendous denial. People have lived with their head in the sand. It's hard to open up your eyes when your head is buried in the sand about what's actually going on. But more and more behind closed doors and in conversations that I do occasionally get invited to participate in, I am seeing that people are beginning to be aware of the absolute danger to the dreams on which they were raised, the illusions on which they were raised, the narrative that they were fed. These talking points are extremely powerful. The only democracy in the Middle East, the notion that Palestinian citizens of Israel are treated better in Israel than Arab citizens are treated in any other country. These are powerful myths. There are many, many, many more myths on which American Jewish ties to Israel are based, and for those who are beginning to open up their eyes, those myths are being punctured rather deeply and rather quickly. Some people are choosing to simply run away. I see a level of disengagement from Israel among Jewish Americans that I could not have anticipated over the past 5 or 10 years. I see some people who are being torn apart. I mean, I think that in terms of their personal identity and who they are and how they've viewed themselves, they're being torn to shreds by what's happening because they want to be able to hold on to the illusion and the myth that they were raised on, and yet they also feel so powerfully about their role as a citizen of the world and a citizen of this country, as a promoter of liberalism and a promoter of equal rights and a participant in progressive movements. And this disconnect is deeply, deeply painful. This could be very, very good for the psychotherapy industry in this country, and I assume that bills are going up and hours are going up. But it's at a very personal level, and I think it is really happening in real time in 2019. It has not yet been reflected in actual leadership from American Jewish institutions, where their established leaders are willing to stand up in public and say that what is happening in the state of Israel today is morally and strategically wrong. And it contradicts the very values of the faith that we were raised in, and it contradicts the long-term interests of having a national homeland of the Jewish people. And that clarity to stand up and say that as the head of a major American Jewish organization, people are too afraid still to do that, but I believe that they are starting to think it in private rooms. Whether or not that means that in the 2020s, one could see an actual change in American foreign policy. No more blank check. No more turning away and allowing things to go on in our name. Whether this can happen rapidly enough that American foreign policy changes such that then Israeli government policy has to change, that's the open question.
So let me follow up, and this sort of links to something that Jafar said and Maya, and maybe Shibley as well, I'm forgetting. So again, I'm speaking as someone who was part of the peace camp, working within the peace camp organizations for years. The framing of focusing on 67 has been an enormously important paradigm for the left, for the American Jewish left. Because it basically suggested put aside the 48, but by resolving the conflict based on 67, Israel we don't have to open up the wounds of 48 that are potentially irreconcilable. And today, in an era where on the ground, setting aside whether it's rational or irrational, I still personally believe this has to end in 2 states eventually and then maybe turns into confederation, whatever, but I don't see any way directly to anything else. The developments on the ground seem to suggest that the 2-state solution is not available right now. We have political developments in Israel and the United States that say, screw 67, we're going to finish 48, right? We're not even talking about 67. We're essentially trying to finish the 48 war with victory. How does that challenge a progressive left, which is literally organized around the idea that we can avoid dealing with 48 if we just resolve 67?
Well, I think that the good news, because I'm always looking for that optimistic take on things, the good news is that there is a growing, with the growing challenge that you're framing in terms of 48 versus 67, and I would frame it in terms of the challenge from the left around rights. It is, I believe, stretching the goalposts and creating a broader center. I think that it allows more people who might not have wanted to even have some of these conversations to have them in the center. And I think that there is the chance that being forced to have this conversation means there will be a much greater wave of support behind more moderate compromise solutions than there might have been otherwise. If not forced into compromise, people may not be willing to rally around compromise. And so I think the specter of raising these issues is extremely important and allows for those of us trying to grab the center and organize in the middle to have a broader base of support. So I think that it is a good thing that these issues are out on the table and that we then take a look in the mirror and say, well, how do we get out of this? And the only way out is, as you said, I mean, I prefer not to use the mortician approach to the two-state solution and declare a time of death. I'm more into the idea that it's in a coma, and it's one for, it's long-term health, and it will ultimately be resuscitated because there is no other way out. And I think that's when you do the resuscitation, is when you take that look in the mirror and you realize what your choices are.
So I know Shibley wants to add something, but before you do, Shibley, I'm going to have a discussion, a very quick sidebar between Jafar and Jeremy. And I want you to explore whether or not there is common ground possible on this question of whether or not the Jewish state issue, whether this is an irreconcilable point. Because that is really fundamental. Whether you're talking about a two-state solution or some sort of shared non-binary solution, either it is framed in terms of we have ethnic, a Jewish state or Jewish identity, or it's framed in terms of shared or something else. Is it possible, and I want you guys to have a second to talk about this in front of all these people and on video, is it possible to even imagine there is a compromise point there where there's a formula that would actually be acceptable to both of you? Go for it. I want you guys to have that conversation.
Freely.
Yes. You have
Yesterday we have been in the Congress and we met several staffers, and we discovered that there is a piece of resolution that used in 3 different places the term Jewish state. Guys, we are there. We are 20%. We are not 2% like the Jewish Americans. The Jewish Americans are about 2%, and still you feel equality. You can't, as even somebody that promote two-state solution, you can't put the language of Jewish state. We can agree on self-determination of the Jews with minority rights. Okay, it's just to frame it. This language have been used by Obama administration. It failed. When we had these talks with people around Obama administration, from affiliated with the J Street, this discussion have been like this. They were convinced that if they will add Jewish state, Bibi will deliver two-state solution. Bibi didn't deliver two-state solution. Will never deliver two-state solution. The vision that we should promote here and back home, and we should feel that we are allies in the end of the day, a language that we, the 20% of the voters, potentially will be part of the camp, will feel that the language that the peace camp in Israel and also in the US will use when they talk about two-state solution, they will talk about self-determination and minority rights protection that will give us the possibility to keep our links and relationship to our Palestinian people, even if we are citizens of the State of Israel, and give the Jewish people also their possibility to implement self-determination without forcing the Arab minority to become nothing. Because today, according to different practices in Israel, there is Jews and non-Jews, actually. There is the Jewish nation and there is nothing. Christians, Muslims, Druze, and different communities without any kind of national inspiration and also vision and status. So in this sense, part of the frustration when you ask people why you don't want to go and vote, they tell you, Okay, we went and vote. But like the Jewish nation law is part of the agenda of the left in Israel, not only of Netanyahu. So in this sense, you need to convince the Arab community, the game changer, I would say, to go out to convince the Jewish population that the vision of two-state solution will not mean the isolation of the Palestinian inside Israel as second-class citizens. And if we will not be able to think that we can convince, 20%, think about it, if each one of us will catch one Jewish citizen and convince him that there is different vision than the vision of Netanyahu, we will become 50%, and then it will be easier. My brother in 88 was putting a Palestinian flag in Haifa. He was considered terror. He was jailed half a year of his life because of the Palestinian flag. He felt Palestinian already in 88, not today. And today, like everybody knows, Shibley, with your research also, that in certain point there will be two-state solution, okay? If you want the Palestinian community in Israel to feel that they will contribute to this vision, they have to feel that the two-state solution will protect their collective rights as citizens of the state of Israel and will keep their links to their Palestinian people, and they will have the access to Bethlehem because the Christian in Nazareth want to go to Bethlehem. So Oslo partly ignored the fact that the Palestinians inside Israel have also their needs, their family links. So it's not complicated. I see it potential. I see we are the potential of making Israel normal place without isolating the Jewish people in a ghetto. In this sense, this is like the good news. We speak Hebrew, we speak Arabic. We have 5,000 students that study in Jenin American University. I don't want in the two-state solution to prevent them from going there, and in the same time, we can't build university in Nazareth because it's a Jewish state. So in this sense, you have to upgrade your discourse if you want us to feel that we are part of the camp that can defeat Netanyahu in certain point and, increase the possibility to create democracy in this country.
So I'm afraid I'm a bad foil for this, Lara, because I'm one of the few people that refuses to use the term Jewish state. I have the exact same problems as Jafar with the concept. It's a losing battle. I'm 99 to 1. I lose this battle in the American Jewish community. But I think that the use of the adjective Jewish in front of a non-religious construct of a state is a terrible idea. What I think underlies, I hope, what Jafar is saying is that the Palestinian people and the Jewish people are equal. The two peoples have a national identity. There are 15 million Jews scattered around the world. They're part of a nation of people. There are 12 million Palestinians scattered around the world. They are part of a people that has a national identity. In order for this conflict to end, both of those two peoples have to have a state somewhere that they can call their home. That is the place where they fulfill their collective right to self-determination. They both happen to want that in the exact same piece of land. So the only way to avoid killing each other for the rest of eternity is to decide, well, okay, we'll split the land and you have this part of it and we'll take that part. And in that part, you exercise the right to self-determination for your people. And then within that state, you guarantee equality to all the citizens of that state, both states, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity. And I don't want to get in trouble for forgetting a group, but trust me, I would mean by this all possible designations for equality within that state. And I don't think we're helped by calling it a Jewish state. I think the best way to refer to it is always in the exact same terms. So I think that one state should be the national home of the Palestinian people, and the other state should be the national home of the Jewish people. And when you say that, you need to add the phrase with equality for the rights of all its citizens, regardless of blah, 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 in both states. And that's, to me, the vision. That is the way out of this. And when you shorthand it to Jewish state, it immediately erases the possibility of having that discussion. But it doesn't mean that I don't believe that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination, and I certainly believe the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. So I think there is a compromise. This phrase, though, is, I don't know, I think that the battle to erase this from the lexicon in this country is one of my more uphill battles. But I'm in line with you, Jafar, and I know that we agree on this.
And Shibley, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, first of all, I want to, recognize Jeremy and J Street's efforts in engaging the mainstream on this, because this has been an important battle, and they've really managed to engage the mainstream in ways that weren't possible a long time ago. And I have to say, just as a quick anecdote, Jeremy was sitting right next to me, or I was sitting right next to Jeremy at a mainstream event when David Friedman, then the designated ambassador to Israel, was asked whether he would meet with J Street, and quickly dismissed it as they're not even Jewish. And I was thinking right next to Jeremy, and I watched your reaction at that time, which was reasonably, very actually restrained, I would have to say. But I want to ask you a question that really ties this broader question and engagement you have with Jafar. As you know, I do polling here in the U.S. as well on this issue, and I've highlighted the emerging difference between Democrats and Republicans over the years, with Democrats being far more, wanting to be more even-handed than pro-Israel, and that has expanded over the time, and we see the impact of it electorally now, even in the American discourse, with American political Democratic candidate willing to criticize the Israeli government as a way of gaining, credit with their constituents, which is very, very unusual. But one question that I have asked over the years is, if the two-state solutions are no longer possible, which of the following would you support? The Jewishness of Israel, even if it meant that non-Jews would not have full equal citizenship, or the democracy of Israel, even if it meant that Israel would no longer be a Jewish state? And overwhelmingly, over the years, a majority of Americans of all kinds, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, say, I would choose democracy over Jewishness. That is the reality in America, and certainly among Democrats, overwhelmingly so. I mean, like 90% say so. Now, I want to ask you that question. Let's say tomorrow morning you wake up and you believe it's no longer possible to have a two-state solution. And it's just not going to happen. It's not just coma, it really is dead. What would you advocate?
So, I love when presidential candidates in debate say, well, I'm not going to entertain a hypothetical. So I'm not going to entertain a hypothetical like that. But, in all seriousness, it's fine as an academic question, I think, but it is not the world in which I choose to operate. It is my purpose and the mission of our organization to prevent that day from arriving. And so I will continue to fight that proposition. It is inconceivable to me as a Jew that the state that, quote unquote, is my state and represents me, the state of my people, could treat other people the way that I was once treated and my family was once treated in other people's states. It is absolutely inconceivable that the thousands of years of Jewish oppression and history didn't teach us about justice sufficiently, that when we have power, we don't know how to exercise it justly. And to me, that is inconceivable, and I will, given my strong identity and my strong faith, I will continue to fight for a state that lives up to the highest of the ideals that I was raised on, and this is not it. And so that is why I fight, that is why I do what I do, and I will not accept that hypothetical.
All right, so that's a great segue. We're going to go to Q&A from all of you. So there is a lovely lady with a microphone in the back. If you could raise your hands if you have questions. We ask that they be in the form of a question that starts with a who, what, where, when, how, something like that, and ends with a question mark. And I am tough. So we have first question is right up front. And if you want to get ready and have your hands ready for the next question, again, if you don't have questions, we can talk up here for another hour, but it'd be much more fun to engage you. Can we make sure that that mic is on? Okay, it should be on
Yep,
now. There you go. And if you could just identify yourself and
Hi,
ask your question.
my name is Elaine Rubin. I'm a fellow traveler of many of the groups represented here today. I'm wondering why it is that none of you can offer a bit of a solution by way of recognizing that Jewish is a much more fluid term than Bibi seems to think, or the rabbinical forces that have been created in Israel seem to think. I'm an American Jew. My values include respect for women. My values include a variety of religious practice. My value, so the Jewish state that I want to support is not the one that was being demanded or described. And I think that, kol hakavod to Jeremy and the work that J Street does, we need to be more articulate about explaining why not only is it useful to talk about a homeland for the Jewish people, but also to talk about the variety of discourse that should lead us to.
Does anyone want to comment on that?
That was a good contribution to the
All
conversation.
right. All right, so any other questions? If there are no questions, I will ask. Okay, right here at the window.
Hi, I'm Leah Muskin-Pratt from the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. I want to appreciate the insistence on talking about root issues. And in that vein, if we're talking about the root of the problem, congressional progressives have been very brave about talking about the root of American racism, right, and white supremacy. That's been the very brave way they've answered the Trump era. But as Maya said really well, they're not bringing that same bravery and integrity and connection to reality to the conversation on Israel-Palestine, right? There is, even in the face of the nation-state law, I'm seeing the resolutions that, Jeremy, your organization is supporting say, SRES 234, Jewish and Democratic State, I just checked, it's in there. And HRES 236, Jewish and Democratic State, it's in there, right? So this myth is still being sold that's helping us avoid the root problem of inequality. And, I feel we got at it but didn't name it this way, racism, as being something that the two-state discourse and the occupation is a symptom of like Israeli racist insistence that there be separate and unequal for Palestinians. So in that context, I'm curious, I'm sorry I'm struggling with this mic, what would you have progressives say instead of Jewish and Democratic State, right? Like what should be the progressive answer if they're gonna talk about racism in this country and dismantling structural inequality? What should they say about Israel-Palestine if they're gonna say we're gonna dismantle structural inequality and support equality, justice, freedom? What does that policy look like, and also how can we justify the ongoing support for this sort of two-state discourse that's been deferring justice? Thank you.
Thank you. And for future questions, aim them at someone specific, or we have this moment of, hey, who wants to take it? Anyone want
So
to
I can,
address that?
I feel a need to say something that will be, I don't say it to be a contrarian on this point, I just think it's important to share my personal views on this. And so first and foremost, the Palestinians living under occupation have the right through their representatives, ideally better ones, but the point is they have the right to decide what to advocate for, and I think that's paramount, most important thing. Secondarily, though, Jeremy, I'm actually still a two-stater. I just don't think my position is rational. And I'm not saying that to be glib about it. I truly believe that that is the only way we get to a solution that is viable for both Palestinians and Israelis. So one of the things that I think is important, and I really appreciate your question, because it is a moment where the conversation is opening up, and I'd like us not to create a litmus test where if someone says they're a two-stater, then the conversation is over. I don't think that's a viable way for us to have this. I would love one state with two people living freely. I don't see how that comes to be. Therefore, my policies are still about what is possible. And I appreciate the way you framed it, Jafar. I think that's an important part of that conversation. But I'll say that as saying someone will defer completely to Palestinians living under occupation who make that decision, not me in DC. But the second point I want to make is about language, because I think she's got a really good question, Jeremy. The democratic Jewish state doesn't work. It's a lovely qualifier, but it doesn't work. And it is about having, and I'll turn it over to you to sort of answer that, but in the same frame, I want to say, Jewish people having a right to a homeland, if that's one definition of Zionism, then I don't think that definition of Zionism is something we can equate with racism, right? So political Zionism is one thing, and we can, as the progressive left builds consciousness on this issue, I think it's important to have that conversation, but the idea that Jews have a right to a homeland becomes, like the two-state, yet another litmus test, is also something we have to be sort of sensitive to. And I realize that those are talking points that don't normally come from this side of the microphone, so to speak, but I think those are important for us to talk about when we want to be impactful and how we advocate better for Palestinian human rights, because I don't feel like I have the privilege of continuing to be ineffective. I've never felt that way.
Shibley?
So, yeah, I think one sobering thing that we have to keep in mind is that if there is no two-state solution, whatever we might want as an outcome, that's not necessarily what's going to happen on the ground. And in fact, when you ask Israelis and Palestinians, what would happen if there's no two-state solution, very few believe there would be one state with equal citizenship. Very few. Majority believe violence for years to come, status quo will continue in various forms. That's the reality, and that's a reality that's even worse, than what we have now. So therefore, that's one reason why people have a tough time abandoning the two-state solution, because of that it's not just that you're abandoning what you thought was a nationalist issue, but the outcome may not be in our hands, and it's not impossible to envision that an ultra right-wing government that's even worse than what we have. I mean, whenever you think it can't get worse, it does get worse, and then you could have an attrition and expulsion and all sorts of things that could happen in the West Bank as an outcome, because the more adamant in keeping or maintaining a Jewish state. And yes, the international community is a factor always, but it hasn't stopped other episodes that are of this sort from happening historically or now. So let's keep that in mind. So that also leads me to believe that for me, as an egalitarian human being, looking at this conflict, and when I'm advocating, I'm not really focused on political outcomes per se. The political outcomes, fine, you could advocate a two-state, you could advocate a one-state, you could advocate whatever it is that you want to advocate. I am concerned about people having dignity, human rights, and equality under any circumstances, whatever the political outcome, and I want that today, not tomorrow, because I don't want the promise of political outcome to distract me from the injustice that is occurring today. And that has to be the message. It has to be consistent. It has to be consistent with justice toward Jews, not towards Arabs. And you can't just defend Arabs by attacking Jews. And one of the problems with identity politics is that for Arabs who want to coexist, and most of them understand this, and in fact have crafted a message against it, they also don't want to be threatening to the Jews at the very same time that they want to call for their own equality. But obviously those on the extremes want to push you to be threatening to the other to rally it. That's a trick. I don't know that there is a good answer to it, but that's kind of the guidance that we must have in approaching this issue.
All right, let's take a couple of questions together. We have one in the front and one out there in the back, so hold your question. Let's start here. Let's take these in. If there's any more, raise your hands. We have about 10 more minutes.
Okay.
So,
I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So one issue you just mentioned, dignity, and I'm wondering if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came into being as a result of the Holocaust, has any moral force in here, and also Johann Galtung has there are different conceptualizations, like a six-state solution, Middle East modeled after the European Middle East community, and an organization of security and cooperation in the Middle East. So there are other ideas like that, and also what's the connection? What about framing it as ending the occupation, or the connection between the frame as two-state and ending the occupation?
thanks. And then in the back, we had another hand. Anything else? This is going to be the last call for questions.
I had a
Okay.
question for Jeremy. I was sort of wondering, you were sort of implying that Jewish leaders would eventually speak out against kind of this established narrative. I didn't know if you meant to imply that. Do you think Jewish leaders eventually will speak out against the established narrative? And more so, will that affect the average American voters? Do you feel like average Americans are waiting for Jewish leaders to speak out, and will that radically change things for average Americans, or will that just be sort of voice in the void?
All right, so we have two questions. I'm actually going to say this is an opportunity. I start with Jeremy. We're going to work our way down. So we end with Jafar. You can answer either of those questions if you'd like, or you can just take a moment and say anything you feel like needs still to be said. And Jeremy, I know that you wanted to comment on the question of shifts in the Israeli political scene and how that speaks to the possibility of working together Arab parties and Jewish parties. So you can use this moment to talk about that if you'd like.
I don't think that the present leadership of the present institutions is likely to speak out. I think that the impact of right-of-center donors on those institutions and on those leaders is too strong, and that it's a structural issue within American Jewish life that more liberal people put the majority of their money into universalist and secular institutions, and more right-leaning people put their money into Jewish institutions. And so I think that we are seeing that selection bias caused by the source of the funding. So no, I don't anticipate that those leaders will actually speak out. I think it will have to be fresh voices from outside the existing structures and existing institutions. Having said that, I do want to take a moment to pick up on what Lara said, because one voice that is missing a little bit from this conversation that I just want to put in is a fresh voice of some younger, progressive Jewish Israelis who are trying to sit with their colleagues in the Palestinian Israeli community and have this difficult conversation about the basis on which a political alliance can be struck. And my colleague with J Street, Yael Patir, who is our director in Israel, and some of her other younger progressive Jewish leaders are engaged in really intensive dialogue that has been beginning over the last year to really take some shape. It is unbelievably important, as Jafar said, that political change in Israel will only happen when this integration takes place. But this integration will only take place when you have some really difficult conversations and you try to identify how to accept some unbridgeable gaps and then move ahead because you have too much at stake to let those gaps prevent you from acting together. I think that the future of the state of Israel depends on this conversation. I think that it is a vital part of shifting the politics, and it brings me back to the question from the window, which is, you know, are we as progressives in this country going to call out what is happening over there? And I would say the answer to that has to be yes. That we have to recognize that this is not an Israeli problem, this is not an American problem, this is a global problem we have right now. The threat to democracies, the threat to our liberal values, the threat to some of the fundamental things we have began to assume were taking hold around the globe in the last 70 years is global. And there are forces, economic, communications, others, that transcend the boundaries of Israel and transcend the boundaries of the United States. We must fight xenophobia, racism, bigotry, intolerance wherever it raises its head. We must fight trends away from democracy that threaten the institutions of democracy, from free media to judiciary, judicial independence. All of these things are under threat in Israel. They are under threat in this country. They are under threat around the world. And progressives have a duty and a need to unite in common cause against those kinds of threats and against those trends. And I think that that applies within Israeli politics for Palestinian and Jewish citizens as well. And I have some hope that there is some conversation beginning on that score.
This is where I surprise everybody with optimism. I want to cite your poll, Jeremy. J Street just did a poll of Democratic primary voters where 75% said they preferred a candidate who took a balanced perspective in terms of both Palestinian and Israeli rights. So I think that's a significant shift that we've been seeing for some years, actually. It's similar to the polling we've done in the past. So yes, the partisan shift continues to grow, but the understanding of this issue is changed the discourse, and I think that's super important. And then my only other observation is what Jafar said, which was guys were here. I think for me that is the perhaps most important statement that was made during our discussion. Guys were here is the point to be made, whether it's 20% of the population in terms of Palestinian citizens of the state, or larger or smaller, we're here. And I'm particularly hopeful about the role that the Palestinians within the state of Israel are playing now in this discourse. Lara's right when she said there was this sort of awkward placement historically when we talked about this issue. Now we're looking to the Palestinian leadership of the state of Israel. We're looking to all of you to help us get the other parts of this perhaps better. And I think those are two things to be particularly hopeful about.
Let me end with two thoughts. One about it's really impossible to completely separate what's happening for the Palestinians inside Israel from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict outside. For many reasons I won't get into, but it's impossible to separate. And we are on the verge of a major, in my opinion, escalation in the conflict with Israel and the Palestinians. That is going to be a function of, particularly if we have the current Israeli government is reelected, and obviously with the blessing of the Trump administration, with many scenarios that had been ruled out before playing out, and therefore it's going to intensify the tension among Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel down the road, and we have to be mindful of that. But I want to end really with just a thought on what we're witnessing here in terms of American policy toward this issue. And I think that it is, we should be mindful of the language that we use. This is not a pro-Israel administration. This is an administration that is a disaster for both Israel and the Arabs, for both Israel and the Palestinians. It is, there will be no winners here. Everyone would be a loser. This is not an administration, and the people who are advising this administration are not advising it with a rational assessment of what's good for Israel, but implementing a far-right ideological position that ultimately will come back to hurt Israel. And the defining, everyone is entitled to their faith. Religion is fine. Most people have faith, whether they're Arabs or Jews, Muslims, Christians. Everyone is entitled to their faith. Every faith must be respected. But faith cannot be the basis of political sovereignty in the 21st century. And you cannot use it. And if you employ it as a political justification for control and bypassing international law and norms, you are encoding a definition of a conflict that is disastrous down the road. You are planting the seeds of future conflict inside and outside. And we must stay away from calling this administration pro-Israel. This is a disaster for Israel as well as for the Arabs. Yes, Palestinians may be bigger losers than Israeli Jews, but both will lose.
Thank you. And Jafar, you get the last word.
Look, I totally agree with your statement about the current administration. I totally agree that at the end of the day, this administration is much more pro-settlements or settlers than pro-Jewish Israelis. The lack, like the crisis envision what kind of people we want to be in the next 20 years. This is something that we see it every day in our interaction with the Jewish population inside Israel. Haifa is discriminated. The Jewish Haifa is discriminated. Not only the Palestinian Haifa is discriminated as a result of the allocation of the resources to implement occupation, surround Gaza, and also to build more and more roads and settlements and walls around even Sinai. What we can do as a Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel is to bring on the table the core issues of 48, yes. third of the Palestinians inside Israel are internally displaced people, refugees. Around Israel and Palestine, there is millions of refugees. If Israel is interested in reconciliation, Israel will start with Iqrith and Ber'am with a third of, they will not change anything in the demographic balance. But Israel will start with the core issue of what happened in 48 and then start to build trust and peace based on reconciliation process. The self-determination language, I was happy to hear that you use self-determination. It's not Jewish state. That is totally different. And when it comes to self-determination, it's like not, what's the election today in Israel is about? It's about, Lieberman fight against Shas. It's not about the two-state solution. It's about who's Jew and what it means, third of the Jewish immigrants, the immigrants from Russia, are not Jews. But the Ethiopian immigration that want to come to Israel, they're still stuck in Addis Ababa. They can't immigrate to Israel because they are half, Christians or Muslims. So they can't make the aliyah, while the Russian white, they can make the aliyah and they can fight. And the fight today is between Shas and ultra-Orthodox. What is Jewish state, what it means. Is it the way that Shas and Yahduta Torah implemented or the way that Lieberman want to implement it? What is the Jewish state when you talk about the Jewish state? I think that you should upgrade your language and also in Israel, because the advisors of the previous administration here told them that the use of Jewish character of the state is good for a two-state solution. Secret. We are the Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel and the settlers are the only two groups that actually practice one-state solution. We practice the one-state solution. The 5,000 students that can't find university in Nazareth and go to Jenin and Birzeit, we practice the one-state solution. Go Saturday to the checkpoints and you will find thousands of Palestinians. They don't want us in Eilat, so we enjoy Bethlehem and we enjoy Jericho. So in this sense, yes, since 2004, as a result of the quartet intervention, they opened the the checkpoints and they enable us much more to interact with the occupied territories. But we know that it's not sustainable. Palestinians and citizens of the State of Israel will put their money in Romania, okay? And they will invest, but they know that Ramallah is not sustainable, and people want to buy houses in Rawabi, but they know that Rawabi is not sustainable. They know that there will be breakdown of another round of violence, and what is preventing another round of violence is the crisis between us, between the Palestinians, is the fragmentation between Hamas and Fatah. This is what is preventing the Palestinians to go out and struggle again and to end the occupation. Because it's very close. People think that ending the occupation is very far. I see it very close because I saw the 88 when my brother was arrested. Nobody believed that in 93, 5 years later, the Palestinian flag will be there. So in this sense, yes, we consider ourselves game changer to be able to do that. I want to bring the next time here Jewish groups that not affiliated with Gantz, that his campaign started, I killed more Palestinians, not Netanyahu. But we want to bring people that today don't vote for the left in Israel. I think that multiculturalism in their eyes is important, and they understand that they are part of the Middle East, like the Mizrahi community in Israel. That, since 77, they have been voting right-wing, and they are voting right-wing because they hate the left-wing in Israel. And part of the reconciliation between us and the Jewish population need to start with the 80% Jewish citizens that immigrated after 48, because the ones that are preventing reconciliation and talk about what happened in 48 and the refugees is the 20% that support the left today in Israel. So in this sense, to be able to get the 61 seats, we, the Palestinians inside Israel, have to strategize and to update the language that should be used. And in this sense, to talk about social justice, today in Israel, we were, me, my son, my nephew, 20 people arrested beaten by police officers, and suddenly, for almost 48 hours in the jail and even the hospitals, we were talking with police officers about the housing prices in Israel. You need to pay today almost $1 million in Tel Aviv to have a house to subsidize the occupation. That's why they need to, and nobody want to talk about social justice in Israel because they don't want to link the social justice. They want to talk about the middle class in Israel, to talk about social justice and the price of occupation. And, we will not be the ones to say we don't want the two-state solution because we enjoy the one-state solution as a Palestinians. Because in the end of the day, you need to upgrade the language, you need to have some kind of self-determination, but you need to ensure open borders. We want Bethlehem, it's part of Palestine. And for the Palestinians that left Haifa in 48, here in the US, they want to come and to enjoy Haifa and to feel that Haifa is for them still part of their heritage. Like the only nation, I think, that implemented the right of return after 2,000 years is the Jewish people, but they think that they can prevent us from thinking and dreaming about our homeland as a Palestinians. It can't, even after 100 years and in two-state solution. For any Palestinian, they will come and treat Haifa and Akka as part of his Palestinian identity, even if it will be part of the two-state solution. So in this sense, we need to be brave enough to put a new language outside, not to keep saying, it's title, two-state solution. Everybody is tired from this title. They want to run away. Let's upgrade it. Yes, self-determination. Let's talk about it. Let's implement it in a way that it will be based on truth. Yeah, something terrible happened in 48, and let's build a future that we say, I understand the need of the Jewish people for self-determination. They have to understand that the self-determination of the Palestinians is their right, but also in the two-state solution, you can't ignore my right to be Palestinian inside Israel as national minority with our unique links and cooperation and ties with my Palestinian brothers and sisters, and who is better than the Jewish Americans to tell how it's possible to do it. The Jewish Americans, with their ties to Israel, is doing much better job than us in making sure that Israel far away will get your support. I want to support the Palestinian state. I will want to feel Palestinian, and I want to feel citizen of the state of Israel, and I want the state of Israel to recognize my collective identity, and this is something that is possible. We don't have to use always the language. We can use the language of the Belgians, we can use the language of the Spanish, and even the Scottish. We need to bring a new language, more clear, that will touch the roots of the conflict and build better future, and it's doable. And if not in this election, we will fail to bring this language in this election. I want you to do better in your election in the US. Usually Jewish Americans always tell us, why you didn't vote? Why only 52% of the Arab community went and voted? I want you to go and vote, and to vote to the right senators and members of the Congress that will support peace and reconciliation. And I want my community to go and support, but with a clear vision, what will the future look like? And this is something that we can design. We, remember, Jeremy, the ones that brought the vision of two-state solution was Hadash, was the Arab community already in the 50s and the 60s. Today, Hadash understand, and everybody understand, you need to upgrade the language of reconciliation, the language of peace, and yes, it will include self-determination, not only as a right, as a need.
All right, so on that very hopeful note, we're going to wind this up. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to all of our panelists, and a special thanks to Jafar. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. So thank you very much.